Greetings to everyone with us. On behalf of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, I would like to welcome you to the third lecture of the JP2Lecture series this academic year. The series is organized by the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, which is a part of the Faculty of Philosophy at the Angelicum. Today's lecture, as well as the entire JP2Lecture series, could not have taken place without the support of our university authorities and the donors and supporters of the Institute, whom I would like to kindly thank. The St. John Paul II Institute of Culture was established to look at the challenges facing the modern world and the Church in light of the thought and heritage of St. John Paul II. The idea of thinking with John Paul II has been embodied in the JP2Lecture series of monthly lectures by prominent interdisciplinary scholars who reveals the extraordinary contribution of John Paul II for our own day. It is now my great honor to welcome and introduce today's special guest, Professor George Weigel, a Catholic philosopher and theologian, and one of America's leading public intellectuals. He is Distinguished Senior Fellow at Washington Ethics and Public Policy Center and holds the EPPC's William E. Simon Chair in Catholic Studies. George Weigel is the author of over 20 books. The first volume of his biography of Pope St. John Paul II, Witness to Hope, was a New York Times bestseller. His writing appears in a variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal and the First Things. George Weigel has received 90 honorary doctorate degrees, as well as the Papal Cross Pro Ecclesia et Pontifice. In his lecture, Professor Weigel will look into John Paul II's teaching on the priority of culture in the free and virtuous society of the future, which will serve as a starting point to analyze contemporary Western culture wars and the best ways to engage in these struggles. Professor Weigel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Father Cesare, and good afternoon, everyone here in person and joining us on the live stream. I'd like to begin by getting out of Father Cesare's way here. I'd like to begin by thanking the authorities of the Angelicum for welcoming me back this semester, Father Cesare himself for his leadership of this program. I'd like to mention in a special way Dariusz Karłowicz, who is the head of Theologia Polityczna in Warsaw, which co-sponsors the Institute here. He's not feeling well right now. We hope he's feeling better soon. He's a remarkable thinker and a great 21st century Catholic. We hope to see him back here soon. And also to thank his associate, Marta Broniewska, who makes my life here very easy and pleasant. While these lectures during the 2023-2024 academic year take as their primary reference point John Paul II's 1999 letter to artists, I'm going to take a somewhat different tack and address the question of Christianity and culture through the prism of John Paul's thinking on public life in the free and virtuous society of the 21st century. And I'm going to do so through the prism of a different textual reference point, the Pope's 1991 encyclical Centesimus Annus. In that epic encyclical, John Paul taught that the free and virtuous society of the post-Cold War future would have three interlocking parts. Think of that old depiction of the Trinity of three interlocking circles. The three component parts would be a democratic polity, a democratic political community, a free economy, and a vibrant public moral culture. By democratic polity, John Paul meant a political community in which fundamental rights are constitutionally defined and legally protected, in which the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of government are distinct and mutually limiting rather than unitary and omnicompetent, in which those who govern do so according to the rule of law, and in which the natural and voluntary associations that make up civil society are, in their proper spheres of responsibility, protected in law from the encroachments of the state. By free economy, the Pope meant a legally regulated market-centered economy rather than a state-centered and state-dominated economic system. Yet it was the third sector of the free and virtuous society, the public moral culture, that John Paul believed to be the key to the proper functioning of the democratic polity and the free economy, and thus of the entire edifice of the free society. Political and economic freedom, he knew, let loose tremendous human energies. Disciplining and directing those energies so that they lead to genuine human flourishing and social solidarity is, he taught, the task of the public moral culture. Its health was thus crucial to the well-being of free politics and free economics. Absent a vibrant, truth-based public moral culture rooted in a true understanding of the human person and human community, free politics and free economics could, and likely would, self-destruct. The sad experience of the Weimar Republic, never far from John Paul II's imagination when it came to thinking about 20th century politics, was a powerful example of this. Interwar Germany had a well-designed political system of the sort just noted. Yet despite German achievements in the hard sciences and technology, the Weimar years were also marked by a high culture of rather extraordinary decadence. Think of the musical Cabaret, which actually cleaned things up rather a great deal. Thus, when the pressures of historic resentments and the economic follies of the Treaty of Versailles combined with the world financial collapse of the Great Depression, the Weimar Republic lacked the solid moral cultural foundation on which to resist the siren song of totalitarianism as an answer to the resulting political gridlock, lethal inflation, and social dissolution. Weimar democracy then voted into power the National Socialist or Nazi regime that immediately used the tools of the Weimar Constitution to dismantle German democracy and install a dictatorship run by the Führerprinzip, the leader principle. The result was a second world cataclysm in which that Karol Wojtyła knew firsthand through his experience of the Nazi occupation of Poland from September 1939 through the spring of 1945. Put another way, John Paul II in Centesimus Annus taught that democracy and the market economy are not machines that can run by themselves if only the mechanisms of politics and the economy are properly designed and built. Democracy and the free economy, he understood, are ongoing experiments. And the success of those experiments can never be taken for granted. That success requires a critical mass of virtuous people so that the machinery of freedom works properly in the political and economic spheres. In the tripartite free society, it is the responsibility and task of the public moral culture to form that critical mass of citizens, and it is the church's task to shape that culture formation according to the moral truths inscribed in us and in nature, forming virtuous citizens who live the cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, courage, and moderation in their personal and public lives. John Paul II came to understand the priority of culture in human affairs from his philosophical work and his theological reflection on the Christian experience of the Church as itself a culture, a point to which we'll return presently. I would also like to suggest that the Pope's thinking and teaching on culture reflected not only his mature intellectual endeavors, but also and perhaps primarily his Polish heritage and experience. Poland, the state, disappeared from the map of Europe in 1795 at the time of what is called the Third Polish Partition, when Russia, Austria, and Prussia completed the vivisection of an 800-year-old state, which had begun with the partition of 1772 and had continued in the partition of 1793. Yet Poland, the nation, survived. Indeed, Poland, the nation, survived with such vigor that the Polish nation could give birth to a new Polish state in the aftermath of World War I in 1918. Later, in the years following the partition of September 1939, when Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union canceled Poland and the Polish state disappeared from the map of Europe again, from late 1939 until mid-1945, the Polish nation survived, and with sufficient strength that after another 4.5 decades of struggle, the Polish nation in the revolution of 1989 gave birth to a truly Polish state, which replaced the bogus Polish People's Republic installed in 1945 by the tanks and bayonets of the Red Army. How did that happen? It happened in 1918 because after the final partition of 1795, the Polish nation survived through its language, its literature, and its Catholic faith, as the church became a kind of safe deposit box of Polish national identity. In a word, Poland, the nation, survived the destruction of Poland, the state, because of the vitality of Polish culture. The same dynamic was at work during World War II and during the 45 years when Polish communists allied with the Soviet hegemon to the east usurped the liberties of post-war Poland. It was authentic Polish culture, and particularly Polish Catholicism, that successfully resisted communism's attempt to create new Soviet man in Poland by, among other things, rewriting Polish history and eradicating traditional Polish culture. The church-led resistance to that, it might be noted, led to one of the only jokes ever attributed to Joseph Stalin, who famously said that making Poland communist was like fitting a saddle to a cow. It was Stalin, but you can laugh at that. Knowing all this, and knowing from his Christian faith and his philosophical reflection that the power of truth, courageously articulated, can be a liberating force in human affairs, John Paul II saw in this tenacious Polish culture the key to a future of authentic freedom for his people. And it was that tenacious culture to which John Paul appealed and which he revitalized during his epic first papal pilgrimage to his homeland, June 2nd to 10, 1979, 9 days we can now see on which the history of the 20th century pivoted into a more humane direction. What did John Paul II do during the 9 days? He gave back to his people the truth about themselves as a nation formed by a distinctive culture, and did so without a single reference in over 50 addresses to either politics or economics. You are not, he said in many variations on one great theme, who they, the communist authorities he never mentioned, say you are. Let me remind you who you really are. Own that, and you will find tools of resistance that communist totalitarianism will not be able to match. It's true that you do not have power as the world understands power in material terms, but you have a spiritual and cultural power that, unleashed, will eventually prove invincible. Which is what happened over the next decade as a revolution of conscience swept through East Central Europe and made the nonviolent revolution of 1989 and the collapse of European communism possible. A revolution of the spirit brought down the empire that had monopolized material power in that part of the world since 1945. That was the gist of John Paul II's analysis of the year 1989 in Chapter 3 of Centesimus Annus. And while some today are still unwilling to recognize the power of a culturally based resistance movement formed by religious conviction to defeat a foe that held all the levers of worldly power, America's premier historian of the Cold War, Professor John Lewis Gaddis of Yale University, got it exactly right when he wrote several years ago that the beginning of the end of European communism came on June 2nd, 1979, when John Paul II got off the plane at the Warsaw airport and kissed the ground of his homeland, then calling the Holy Spirit to once again renew the face of the earth of this land. The deficiencies of Weimar Germany's public moral culture were a major factor in the collapse of the free society in a Germany that became a totalitarian state. The power of Polish culture was the key factor in the auto-liberation of Poland in the Revolution of 1989. Culture, what a people believes, worships, and cherishes, is the driver of history over the long haul. Believing in false gods, worshiping that which is not worthy of worship, and cherishing that which is not truly noble leads to forms of cultural decay that can promote neither human flourishing nor social solidarity. Culture is the driver of history over the long haul, and a culture that draws sustenance from authentic belief and worship will promote noble desires that can sustain the institutions of political and economic freedom or help restore them when they have been lost. In the thinking of John Paul II, then, the question of culture and history cuts both ways. Cultural decadence leads to immiseration of various forms. Cultural vitality rooted in the truth about the human person can lead to liberation. Which brings us to the question of what have been termed today's culture wars. The very term culture wars alarms some Catholics who do not wish to be derided by the progressive public culture of the West as culture warriors, and to apply that epithet, culture warrior, to those fellow Catholics who judge that something is seriously awry in the West today. Culture warrior has thus become a term of shunning, even disparagement, in certain Catholic circles. But this is not right. And if the mistake in not recognizing that there are indeed culture wars that must be fought, which means that there must be courageous culture warriors, if that mistake is repeated often enough, the Church will be weakened in its capacity to renovate Western culture so that that culture can sustain the free and virtuous society of the 21st century. The term culture war, Kulturkampf, was coined to describe what happened between 1871 and 1887, the years in which German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck tried by various strong-arm tactics, including the imprisonment of bishops, to bring the Catholic Church under the control of the newly established German Reich. The contemporary culture war, however, is being fought across a much wider terrain, and it involves more than the church and state power, although it also involves that. The contemporary culture war, reduced to essentials, is a contest for the moral and cultural future of the West. It is a contest between those who believe that there are truths built into us and into the world, truths that we can know by reason and revelation, truths that illuminate the path to human flourishing and social solidarity. And on the other hand, those who believe there is no such thing as human nature, who believe that humanity is infinitely plastic and malleable, and that the only limits to that malleability are technological, and who, while tacitly accepting Immanuel Kant's alleged destruction of classical metaphysics, reject Kant's dictum that, quote, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. For, these people assert, human willfulness, married to technological capacity, can bring about a worldly utopia, if only those of a classical and biblical cast of mind, who continue to insist that there are deep truths built into the world and into us, truths that we ignore at our personal and civilizational peril, would get out of the way. And if they, meaning us, will not get out of the way by our own volition, then we must be gotten out of the way. This is an important point to grasp. It is not understood by those Catholics who disparage and dismiss other Catholics as culture warriors. For in doing so, they deny the fundamental fact shaping the contemporary culture war in the West. The culture war was declared on us. We did not declare it. Those of a classical and biblical cast of mind, those who believe in what we might call built-in moral truths, were quite willing to debate and dialogue with those who denied the reality of those truths, and who declared in Nietzschean fashion that human willfulness was the full meaning of human liberation and maturation. But the invitation to dialogue was rejected, and the war was declared. And it is folly to think that we can decline to fight it by retreating into those quasi-Benedictine enclaves of Mr. Rod Dreher's fertile imagination. For progressive culture warriors are implicit and in some respects explicit totalitarians who are determined to enforce their power everywhere. When the Second Vatican Council met 60 years ago, it was literally unimaginable to many of the Council Fathers that within 2 generations, abortion would be legally permitted throughout the Western world as a means of ex post facto and quite literal birth control, just as it was unimaginable that a Washington Post headline would deride as forced birth zealots those who defended the right to life of the unborn and wanted to offer women in crisis something a bit better than a technological fix to their problem. It was unimaginable 60 years ago that the Hippocratic Oath would be consigned to the ash heap of history as doctors willingly and with cultural approbation and legal sanction willingly participate in abortion and in the macabre practice of what is now euphemistically known as physician-assisted suicide. The Council Fathers may have been concerned about family stability, indeed they were, and rising divorce rates in the West, but they could not imagine a situation in which marriage would be redefined to include Adam and Steve as well as Adam and Eve. And anyone who in those days suggested that gender was a cultural construct such that by technologically implemented acts of willfulness, a man could declare himself a woman and be legally recognized as such, chromosomes notwithstanding, would have been thought bizarre, if not insane. Yet that which was so recently unimaginable is now prominently on display throughout the Western world. The trans movement is perhaps the clearest indicator of the character of the contemporary culture war. There is no clinical evidence that over time, the euphemistically described procedure known as sex reassignment surgery produces positive mental health outcomes. None. Zero. On the contrary, there is abundant evidence that those who have transitioned, and even in less dramatic ways than by undergoing surgical sex reassignment, are more prone to suicide than others. Yet the legal capacity to transition oneself is now regarded in progressive circles as a basic human right. And just last week, on November 20th, the United States Department of State issued a statement on, quote, Transgender Day of Remembrance, in which it recommitted American diplomacy to, quote, ensuring acceptance and support for transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming persons. So the contemporary culture war is, in essence, a war over the meaning of the human person. And while the specific characteristics of today's battles, as I've just described them, may have been unimaginable 60 years ago, the fundamental character of the conflict was anticipated by one father of the Second Vatican Council, Karol Wojtyła of Krakow, who shortly after the council wrote about his current intellectual project in a letter to his friend, the French Jesuit Henri de Lubac. Cardinal Wojtyła wrote, I devote my very rare free moments to a work that is close to my heart and devoted to the metaphysical sense and mystery of the person. It seems to me that the debate today is being played out on that level. The evil of our times consists in the first place in a kind of degradation, indeed in a pulverization of the fundamental uniqueness of each human person. This evil is even more in the metaphysical order than of the moral order. To this disintegration planned at times by atheistic ideologies, we must oppose, rather than sterile polemics, a kind of recapitulation of the inviolable mystery of the person. How prescient was that? How prescient was that? And while one atheistic ideology determined to remake the human condition may have been overcome by the Revolution of '89, others have come to the fore. For we are living in a moment when it has become ever more clear that the most successful Marxist theoretician of the 20th century was not Lenin or Trotsky. Rather, it was the Italian Marxist theoretician Antonio Gramsci, who argued that conquering the means of cultural production was the key to the ultramundane Marxist utopia of the future. And Gramsci has been vindicated, perhaps beyond even his imagining. For the contemporary culture war in the West is the result of the conquest of the means of cultural production, the universities, the worlds of art, music, and theater, various religious institutions, and the great foundations that support the means of cultural production by a self-described progressive ideology that denies that there is anything properly describable by the term human nature. It thinks of the human person, this ideology, as essentially a bundle of morally commensurable desires, the satisfaction of which is the meaning of human rights. And it is determined to use the instruments of state power, this ideology, and here in Europe, the instruments of transnational power, to impose that ultramundane ideology on all of society. Aldous Huxley, while strikingly prescient about future scientific developments, was not a very distinguished novelist. George Orwell was the more gifted writer of dystopian fiction. Be that as it may, if you marry the stunted and manufactured humanity described in Huxley's Brave New World with the totalitarian brutality on display in Orwell's 1984, you get something that is alarmingly similar to what those who declared the culture war imagine the desirable future, human future, to be. A future that is unabashedly secular and hedonistic. And that must be fought. The question is how? How is the church to address this civilizational crisis, this culture war, in light of the teaching of Pope St. John Paul II? And with what instruments should dynamically orthodox Catholicism engage the war that has been declared on the biblical and Christian concept of the human person? It'll be helpful in considering those questions to understand what both New York Times columnist Ross Douthat and Cambridge historian Richard Rex have both proposed, namely that we are living through the third great crisis of the Catholic Church in the 2 millennia of Christian history. The first such crisis was the Arian crisis of the 4th century. As Professor Rex wrote in 2018 in a review of Ross Douthat's book, To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism, the Arian crisis, quote, gripped the church from the Council of Nicaea to the Council of Chalcedon and beyond. This was an agonized and church-rending argument over the question, what is God? The second crisis was that of the Reformation, which was an agonized and church-rending argument over the question, what is the church? Our crisis, at least as great as those, is all about a question that once would have been expressed as, what is man? The fact that this wording is now itself seen as problematic is a symptom of the very condition it seeks to diagnose. What is it, in other words, to be human? In the October 2023 issue of First Things, just out a few weeks ago, Professor Rex sharpened his analysis further and in these terms. Christianity itself is beset by the third existential crisis in its history, a contemporary crisis over the nature of humanity itself, a crisis manifest on the same global scale as the church herself. More than ever, the question for our times is, what is man? For Christians, it is a crisis over the concept of creation, over Genesis itself. Is man created in God's image, or are we our own creators? The hyper-subjectivism of postmodern culture makes each man or woman, in principle, the unmoved mover of his or her own existence. You can be anything you want is the mantra pushed endlessly by the panoply of consumer capitalism, which preaches the gospel of, in Brad Gregory's lapidary phrase, the goods life. The goods life. And the goods life finds theoretical expression in the identity politics peddled by academic postmodernism, which fancies itself critical of consumer capitalism, but is perhaps better understood as consumer capitalism's established church. How readily, after all, global corporations have imbibed woke values. The ethics of autonomy is pretty much the spiritual equivalent of the supermarket. The reification and idolization of identity are a perfect fit for the theory and practice of marketing in the goods life. It's all about self-image. One wonders how Professor Rex survives at Cambridge with those rather robust views. In a recent speech on accepting the Herzl Prize of the Tikva Fund, the great bioethicist and my dear friend Leon Kass took this a step farther and dug deeper into what he described, and when he described the civilizational crisis and the culture war in which we find ourselves as a war against idolatry. He spoke of the special obligations of the Jewish people, but his call to resistance against the culture warriors who seek to cancel the biblical concept of the human person speaks to Christians as well as those John Paul II described as our Jewish elder brothers. Here is Professor Kass. We are summoned to bear witness against idolatry, that universal temptation to fill the God-shaped hole in our hearts with things that cannot satisfy and that invariably lead astray. Idolatry was once the worship of the sun, moon, and earth, and the golden calf. In modern times, it has come in the diabolical form of ideology, National Socialism, Communism, Maoism, and radical Islam, deadly false gods to which millions of innocent lives have been sacrificed. Idolatry also includes worship of the market, of art and culture, and of human choice and fiat as the sole source of value. Against these, the Jewish people bear witness to the presence of a higher power and source of goodness. As I suggest must Catholics who acknowledge in the Roman canon Abraham, our father in faith. The contemporary culture war inevitably involves the Catholic Church, for if the Church is faithful to her Lord, she will defend and promote the truth about the spiritual and moral dignity of those whom the Lord died and rose to save. And the Church must fight this culture war as a culture-reforming counterculture with the distinctive weapons of evangelical clarity and pastoral charity. Thinking about this is enriched by an encounter with the patristic scholar Robert Louis Wilken, who grew up in Missouri Synod Lutheranism and entered into full communion with the Catholic Church in 1994. In April 2004, Professor Wilken penned a masterful essay, The Church as Culture, which included an assertion that is of great importance to our topic and fully aligned with the thought of John Paul II on culture and history. Professor Wilken wrote, "The church is a culture in its own right. Christ does not simply infiltrate a culture. Christ creates culture by forming another city, another sovereignty." The divisions in Catholicism over the Catholic relationship to the contemporary culture war, evident at last month's synod and in the discussions preceding it, can be understood, I think, through the prism of Professor Wilken's insight. There are Catholics who understand that the church is a culture with a unique foundation in Christ and who live that understanding. Then there are those who, while formally professing the creed, do not quite grasp the full import of the fact that the church is a unique Christocentric culture charged with converting to Christ the cultures in which she finds herself, from classical Greco-Roman to postmodern Western. This division often expresses itself in the so-called hot-button issues of our time. Does the church, as a unique Christocentric culture, have and live an understanding of marriage as the stable, fruitful, lifelong union of a man and a woman? Does the culture that is the church teach a way of expressing human love and intimate relationships formed and bounded by both divine revelation and the deep truths inscribed in human nature? Should the culture that is the church in its interaction with society give priority to the task of promoting a socially embedded and legally recognized reverence for the sanctity of human life at every stage of life and in every condition? Does the culture that is the church believe itself capable of ennobling all human cultures? Because the culture that is the church is an expression of the Christ who is the unique and universal Savior of humanity. And if so, does the church act on that conviction in its evangelization and in its ordering of its own life? The last of these questions came into sharp focus when Archbishop Mark Coleridge of Brisbane, who served as president of the Australian Bishops' Conference from 2018 until 2022, proposed in a pre-synod interview that Indigenous or Aboriginal Australian men should be exempt from the Latin Rite Catholic practice of only ordaining celibates to the priesthood, stating that there is, quote, "no way you're going to recruit a celibate clergy in those cultures." Really? Are some cultures impervious to Christ's call to live celibacy for the sake of the kingdom? Are some cultures impenetrable to the gospel? One can imagine such claims being made in the past about any number of indigenous peoples, peoples of different races and ethnicities, people with different histories. But at the risk of veering into the minefields of wokery, doesn't the assertion that Indigenous Australians are incapable of living celibacy verge on racism? Or to get down to the theological bottom line, doesn't the claim that people in certain cultures cannot hear, much less accept, the more challenging demands of the gospel run perilously close to blasphemy? Is the power of the Holy Spirit so circumscribed? Similar questions arise from the assertions of the LGBTQ+ insurgency within the church that certain people are made a certain way and thus can only love a certain way. This would seem to contradict one of the basic Christian truths that form the church as a unique culture. The truth that as we all, quote, fall short of the glory of the Lord, Romans 3:23. We are all justified, that is, made whole, by the grace of God poured out through Christ crucified. Which is to say that whatever our desires and whatever our confusions, everyone is called to an ongoing, deepening conversion, sanctification, and ultimately glorification that is available to all, if we allow ourselves to be welcomed by Christ on his terms, not our own. The culture that is the church has converted and transformed cultures that may originally have seemed impervious to the gospel, and it has done so for 2 millennia. The church of the 21st century must reckon with that truth, or it will end up tacitly denying the Lord who said, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself." Not some, all. The threats to civilization today, the threats to the human future today, seem almost innumerable. If there is a common thread running through them, it is their denial of the inalienable dignity and infinite value of every human life from conception until natural death. That is what the culture of death, identified as such by John Paul II in the 1995 encyclical Evangelium Vitae, denies about the unborn, the vulnerable elderly, and the severely disabled. That is what Hamas and its imbecile supporters in elite Western universities deny about Jews. That is what Vladimir Putin denies about Ukrainians. That is what Xi Jinping denies by persecuting Christians and committing genocide against Uyghurs. The list goes on and on. In the face of these assaults on the humanum and the vast suffering they cause, the church as culture has no option but to be a counterculture, to be a culture-reforming counterculture that offers humanity a nobler view of itself through the gospel, in the acceptance of which, as we are taught in paragraph 22 of the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, we learn the truth about ourselves as well as the truth about God. That means being culture warriors who wield the sword of the Spirit and call all to conversion in Christ. Not only, and perhaps not primarily by argument, but by displaying a nobler, more humane way of life. Failure to engage the contemporary culture war is not just imprudent or cowardly, it is a dereliction of duty. For only by returning to the truths disclosed by both revelation and reason about the human condition can we avoid self-destruction as a civilization and survive, even flourish. That rescue mission is one that the church has undertaken in the past. That is what the church must do today and in the future. And in that very Catholic sense, culture warrior is a title to be welcomed, indeed embraced. And we find the ideal of the Catholic culture warrior in that apostle of culture, Pope St. John Paul II. Thank you.
Professor Weigel, thank you very much for this excellent lecture, and I know that we have a lot of questions, so that's the time for the questions.
Thank you, Professor Weigel. I enjoyed it very much. I'm almost entirely in agreement with you. I noticed that you, in the course of your lecture, you shifted in the first half from a focus on the West to then latter discussing the church and its battle against and for the world, right? And I was a little disappointed by the focus on the West in the first half of the lecture, because the battle against the humanum is not restricted merely to the West. It is indeed across the world, right? And when we, whether consciously or unconsciously, focus ourselves merely on the West, what we're effectively doing is abandoning entire populations of Christians, Catholics, non-Christian, non-Catholic, to just be consumed by these people. And I'm raising this point largely because I see this as a general trend. The world is now the West. With the European expansion, Europe took over the world. We are all Europe now. Yes, I just want to draw this to attention, maybe elicit some response. Thank you.
It's a very wise comment, and I think at a number of points throughout the lecture, I certainly intended to indicate that this is dappertutto. I mean, this is everywhere. I think I focus on the West at the beginning because this ideology of whatever one wants to call it, ultramundane, autonomous self-progressivism, I think originated in the West. It originated, John Paul II would say, in a corruption of the Cartesian turn to the subject. But it's now been, as you say, exported everywhere because the West has dominant cultural power across the world. I mean, you can watch Disney Plus anywhere in the world, and that's the export of sludge in many respects. I think it was very striking that at the Synod last month, as in the Synod of 2018, the resistance to what I would call the surrender to the zeitgeist that one sees in Germany and other parts of Western Europe was led in many respects by the new churches of Africa and Asia. This actually goes back to 2015, when, as you remember, the debate was over the nature of marriage, its permanence, and the relationship of that to the sacramental order. And it was African bishops who said politely, I'll put it less politely than they did, to their German brethren, don't export your decadence to us. The Christian idea of marriage comes into our traditional cultures as a form of liberation, especially for women, and we don't want to lose that. I think the same resistance is why the what I now call alphabet anthropology, LGBTQ+. I guess it's alphabet arithmetic anthropology, did not make it into the synthesis report of the Synod this year. I would like to think that was in part or primarily because the drafters of that synthesis know that it has never been the practice of the Catholic Church to describe human beings by their sexual desires or their gender confusions or some combination of both. I would like to think that was the case. I'm fairly convinced it was the case, that it was because the management of the Synod understood that there would be great resistance to that, not only from Africa and Asia, but from the living parts of the Church in North America and in Central and Eastern Europe. So you're quite right to draw that out, Father, and thank you for doing that. Perhaps the point to be underscored here is that the leadership of this church as culture transforming counterculture in the second half of the 20th century, or the 21st century, is going to come from the new churches of Africa and Asia. That's a heavy burden to lay on them. But those who have lived the kind of New Testament experience that they have lived are in a very strong position to be the kind of witnesses that we need. And as Paul VI famously said on many occasions, the modern person listens more easily to witnesses than teachers, and if we listen to teachers, it's because they're first witnesses. And I can think of any number of embodiments of that in African and Asian bishops that I've had the privilege of working with over the past decade, many of whom were trained right here at the Angelicum. Thank you.
Hi, Professor Weigel. Thank you, first of all. Excellent presentation, as usual. I'd just like to kind of bring up the point of transgenderism, homosexuality, and gender choice / confusion, whatever you want to call it. I think we should thread a little bit more carefully over there, because I think the issues are more complicated than they seem. And they aren't as well to be put in one category. For instance, in my view, transgenderism could have has more to do with Cartesian privacy and that kind of proliferation of that idea into culture, whereas gender choice or confusion, whatever, has to do more with post-structuralism, you know. Also we need to actually speak to these people in a charitable way. So we cannot leave from the presumption that they are confused or that they are somehow wrong. We need to articulate an anthropology that is coherent. And there are anthropologies that are coherent which are not religious. They are not psychological accounts, because that only relies on behavior, but there are, Aristotle's anthropology can be used as a secular framework, you know, which is quite rational in that sense. So our approach has to be Christian towards transgender people. We really have to kind of get into the experience of that person, you know, perhaps even phenomenologically. And then maybe understand how Cartesian privacy would have an effect on that. And the solution, I guess, would be to dismantle these incoherent frameworks, such as Cartesianism and post-structuralism. Now, that's difficult. And there are thinkers that have done that, but have not gained popularity or have not been acknowledged for it, you know. And people have successfully dismantled the Cartesian framework, yet the Cartesian framework, as we have spoken before, persists and continues to influence culture greatly. Same with post-structuralism, it can be dismantled. So we are working within a tradition, a philosophical tradition, at least I'm here in philosophy, where people are capable of addressing these issues. And they are, but in order to address them, they have to address them in a kind way. So I see a bit of a tension with the idea of a cultural warrior over there, because maybe that term is a bit too strong.
Zach, I think we have to distinguish between contexts here. I was talking about the public context, and particularly the public policy context, where in certain parts of the Western world, I think this is so far limited to the Western world, it is now legally difficult, if not impossible, to address questions of same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria in a classically Catholic sense. It's illegal to do that. That's very different from the therapeutic or pastoral context, where obviously you don't begin by saying, thou art confused, or whatnot. You begin by understanding that people who have these difficulties are in the main suffering, and whose suffering can be, we would assume, assuaged by conversion to Christ, however difficult in certain circumstances that may be. I have a good friend who's a pediatrician. When she is confronted with a self-harming 11-year-old girl who has decided, with no contra input from her parents, that the cause of her self-harming is that she's really a boy, my friend, the pediatrician, is not going to start by dismantling Cartesian subjectivism or post-structuralism. That's for the public debate. You begin by saying, tell me why you feel that way. Are you happy with that? Have you talked to other people about that? What is it in your life that's not coming together such that you're doing harm to yourself, etc.? So I think the sort of arguments I'm making here are not the arguments, is not the approach one would take in either a pastoral or therapeutic context. I think that's fairly obvious. We do have resources for the therapeutic and pastoral context understood in a thoroughly Catholic way in John Paul II's Theology of the Body. There is a very impressive Catholic organization in the United States called Courage, which gets almost no attention, but it's an organization devoted to providing pastoral support for people who experience same-sex attraction. This is very difficult work pastorally, but it's important work, and it's often successful work. And while you don't hand people the Michael Waldstein edition of the Theology of the Body and say, read this, and you will get out of your Cartesian and post-structuralist confusions, you can slowly introduce people to that way of thinking in a way that I think Courage has found is deeply helpful. There is another operation in the United States called Ruah Woods, Ruah from the Hebrew word for breath or spirit. They have created, this is based in Cincinnati, they have created an entire kindergarten to 12th grade curriculum that is a blend of theology of the body and classic children's and young people's literature, that is now being used in all the schools of the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, as well as being available to others around the country. That kind of catechetical approach, beginning in kindergarten, where you have to begin now, given the Disney Plus problem and other things that I was mentioning, is the way to go. In the public space, I think there are two lines of strategy. One is the one you suggest, the dismantling of bad ideas. But while we're doing that, and our friend Evelyn Blacklock is very familiar with this from her work on the US Supreme Court, you have to provide the legal space for that kind of debate to go on. Because the other side, the side that declared the culture war, wants to shut the debate down. And does it by all sorts of inappropriate analogies to slavery, racism, you name it. So it's we need to play good defense as well as playing good offense in the public space. But in the pastoral and therapeutic space, yes, charity, 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 but always understanding that the most charitable thing we can do for people, as any good spiritual director knows, is help them come to an understanding of the truth of their situation. Okay? Yes, Father?
Professor, I would like to ask you, what do you think, what should be the key points or, let's say, strategies for the cultural war in these years, let's say for the church and for the lay leaders, the people in the church and the people who are in the public space?
I think I touched on this a bit. Let me draw it out a bit more. This is a hard thing to say in an ancient university like this, which I think is probably the most solid theological and philosophical faculty in the world today. But we intellectuals count for less in this than we think. Paul VI was right. Witness is the more important thing because in a world that is so deeply confused intellectually, as the trans thing, as the trans ideology demonstrates, that it will be the example of a more noble way of living that opens up for people the question, how can you live that way? Which is the invitation to evangelization and catechesis. Now, that does not mean that we should shut down the Angelicum or that people shouldn't be doing degrees or anything of the sort. We need people who know how to explicate these embedded truths and these gospel truths in a way that the 21st century world can hear. But I have, and those of you who are here who were in my course earlier this year, forgive me for repeating this, but I think it's important. There's a fellow in the United States who I think is teaching at Baylor University now, named Rodney Stark. He's a historical sociologist or a sociologically inclined historian. He's written basically the same book 5 times. With little twists each time. And it's about, the books are attempt to explain from a historical sociological point of view, why did the Christians win? His premise is that whatever happened at the Milvian Bridge, Constantine was a shrewd politician who was joining the winning side. And Stark thinks he can demonstrate that by the time of Constantine, why was Christianity the winning side? Because in a space of 250 years, this gang of nobodies from east of nowhere had converted between a third and a half of the Mediterranean world. That's pretty fast work. And how did they do that? And here we come to the crucial point. They did it less by argument than by example. I often say to adult education audiences at home, everybody think for a moment of the movie Gladiator, which everybody has seen at least 5 times. I mean, it's ubiquitous. You can't escape it. That is not 500 BC. That's the middle of the second Christian century, because remember the movie begins with Marcus Aurelius. And it's still this cold, hard, brutal world in which even the strongest and noblest of men, Russell Crowe, stand up and take a bow, are completely at the mercy, as are their families, of forces that they are absolutely out of control of. And you can lose everything. That's the world of the mid-2nd century AD. Okay, Christians did not live that way. Everybody here in Rome, lives in Rome, knows where Tiber Island is. And I hope you've had a chance to visit that magnificent shrine to the 20th century martyrs at San Bartolomeo. Tiber Island was a dumping ground. Tiber Island is where seriously sick people were left during the time of the Roman Empire. And if they got better, they could come back, and if they didn't, they'd die there. Christians did not do that. Christians cared for their sick. They cared for other people's sick. Time of Maximus and Gladiator, women were chattels, had no legal rights, couldn't own property, etc., etc. Paul is saying in Christ Jesus there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. We have to be a little careful about how we say that these days. He was not a trans ideologist of the 1st century. Women were treated with dignity in the Christian community. Christians did not expose their unwanted children, which was the form of birth control of the time, and so forth and so on. And Stark's argument it was that example that opened up the question, how can you people live that way? And then the door is open. I can live that way because I'm a friend of Jesus Christ. Can I tell you about him? So the more we can make visible that face of the church, the more we have an opportunity to then move on to the new evangelization, which is ultimately the answer to all of this. And the more we can make it difficult for those who would push us out of the public space by declaring illegal our attempts to help people suffering from various forms of confusion, to do so. So in that sense, I am entirely sympathetic to the claim of the past decade that the church must always first display the divine mercy. But the divine mercy also is not to be set against the truths of divine revelation. I mean, the two cannot be contradictory. And I think it would be useful if authorities in the church at all levels would acknowledge how much of that we in fact do. that the Catholic Church is the primary educator of women in Africa today. That the Catholic Church is the primary provider of social services of a humane nature in the third world today. And that's before we get to all of the things that those of us from North America and Europe know are going on through the charitable activity of the Church. I think the challenge for pastoral leaders, priests, bishops, laity, is to continually try to figure out how to transform those institutions of love, of charity, of healing, into platforms for evangelization, which includes parishes. I mean, there should be a close connection in our parishes between their social service work and their evangelical and catechetical work. I mean, it's got to be a package deal. But I think that's the way I would think about that going forward. And one reason, by the way, to make known, for church leadership to make known all of these things we in fact are doing of that healing sort, is this that people are aware of them. They're not going to hear about it on CNN, so they better hear about it from us. Yeah, there was somebody, I'm being blind. Oh, it's Alessandro, hello.
I was thinking of the culture wars in a longer historical context, because it seems to me like the Church and Christianity more broadly have fought several culture wars through history. I mean, you mentioned the Protestant Reformation as a sort of crisis of coming to terms with what the Church was, but there's also a way in which the Reformation period was a moment in which Christianity struggled to define what a Christian is, what it means to be Christian, what Christianity is. And I mean, I think in such an example, it's hard to say whether anyone won in the clearest sort of way. But I mean, you know, certainly the Church and the Catholic world reformed themselves in a way, and I think came out stronger. Yeah. At the same time, they lost a lot of members and, you know, power, control, ability to evangelize in a lot of countries. You know, in the 1800s, you know, the relationship between the Church and the modern state was completely redefined. And I think if you spoke to someone at the turn of the 20th century, nobody would have thought, I think no good Christian would have thought that the Church was winning that war at all. But I think there's a way in which, even in that context, by, one might say, losing that war, losing that temporal power, the Church did, in a way, emerge stronger. And so I'm just thinking, you know, as we face our current culture wars, whether what you think might be, I know it's a hard question, but what you think might be concrete outcomes that we don't really expect, that might actually be non-traditional victories of this culture war.
Thanks, Alessandro. I completely agree with you that there were blessings embedded in what looked like demise. I think the loss of the Papal States was one of the greatest things to happen to the Catholic Church in the last 200 years. The loss of sponsorship, ecclesial sponsorship by state power, is a great blessing. And I'm sorry, but my new Catholic integralist friends are just wrong here. And they're wrong primarily on evangelical grounds. The deadest parts of the world church today Ireland, Quebec, the Iberian Peninsula, are the parts that hung on to state, or in the case of Quebec, political party, sponsorship of ecclesiastical power the longest. And there's a lesson in that. What would be an equivalent to the reemergence of the papacy under Leo XIII as a great moral force in the world, with, among other things, the birth of Catholic social doctrine? Within 2 decades after everybody said, well, that's the ball game, the Pope is stuck in the Vatican, and that's it. I think what I talked about earlier, this extraordinary growth of the church in sub-Saharan Africa, is an important sign of that, of an unexpected thing. No one expected, even 60 years ago at the time of Vatican II, that by the middle of this century, or by, at the latest, the last quarter of this century, the demographic center of world Catholicism would be in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, nobody could possibly have expected that. It's an extraordinary business, and it's going to define the Catholic future for quite a while. No one expected a John Paul II. I mean, I think most everybody here, with some exception, few exceptions, you, Father Cesare, are too young to remember just how back on its heels the church was in 1978. And not only in terms of capacity to shape events in the world, but in terms of its own internal life. And it was a very depressed time. And, within a decade, we're back in an extraordinary way. No one expected that in 1978. One never knows when a Mother Teresa or a Pier Giorgio Frassati or someone like that will come up and embody a way of being Catholic that animates huge numbers of people. I also have to think, although I've been thinking this for a while and reality keeps falsifying my thinking, I've been saying for almost 20 years now, the sum total of human unhappiness with all of this crazy stuff is going to reach a certain critical mass that people are going to say, wait a minute, what's going on here? We're not feeling better. Why are we not feeling better? Hasn't happened yet. And I can't speak for other contexts, but the mental health figures in the United States right now are just appalling, particularly among young people. I have another close friend who's a psychiatrist, was working at a major American university, and the shift she saw in 20 years was dramatic and not in the right direction. That might be another thing. I mean, at some point, people say, wait a minute, this really isn't working. But those are some things. But I completely agree that, the church of the truly reformed Counter-Reformation church was in much better shape than the church of the late 15th century. That's for sure. The capacity of the church to be a culture-forming and world-shaping institution was made possible by, among other things, the demise of the Papal States and the rise of a different form of papacy, which nobody expected in 1870. So yes, I mean, there are undoubtedly surprises out there. There will be great church leaders emerging from not only Africa and Asia, but who expected someone like Bishop Barron to emerge 20 years ago? This guy, what does he have, 13 million Facebook followers or something? 3 million? I don't know, I'm not good on numbers. I mean, that was not expected. This was a serious intellectual who was, running a good seminary, and suddenly he's a, world social media figure, and one of the few good reasons for social media to exist. I mean, these things happen. So, and maybe some of you will be those people in the future. Yes, Evelyn?
Hello. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to ask a little more specific question in the context of this modern divorce of reason and faith, that it seems like it has not been properly healed yet. Because you mentioned the crisis of man that we are living through right now. My question is, isn't this crisis of man also a direct consequence of a certain, let's say, explosive development of technology? And the question that follows is, shouldn't then we as the church also look for its roots there? In the questions about technology, I'm thinking particularly about the dynamics of cyberspace, of all the internet dynamics that I would say we are still not truly aware of in the church. Shouldn't we look there? Shouldn't we also put our effort into understanding this modern technology? And also, I would maybe refer to John Paul II's letter to UNESCO, when he actually raises that point about how our modern ethics, how it still cannot reach technology.
Yeah.
If I could have a comment on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, the first thing I'll say is if you understand John Paul II's address to UNESCO, you understand more than his biographer does. That is one of the densest texts in the entire magisterium of the pontificate. I mean, that's an extraordinarily, if we're talking about the same thing, that's an extraordinarily dense text. He loved it. I found it very difficult to penetrate. But I think it was an expression. I mean, why does the Pope go to UNESCO, educational, scientific, and cultural organization? Precisely because of this priority of culture. That's a good question to which I really don't have a well thought out answer. Is the technological explosion a cause or an accelerator of the kind of trends, deeper cultural trends that Zach was describing 20 or 25 minutes ago? I don't have a settled view on that. There are certainly ways in which a technological, I remember when an IBM Selectric typewriter I thought was the greatest thing since sliced bread and canned beer. I mean, you could correct your mistakes here. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven when I got one of those things. And surely all that has happened since then has made various aspects of life better, and has not necessarily contributed to this degradation and pulverization of the human person. I remember when the second volume of my John Paul II biography, The End and the Beginning, came out, and that was in 2010, So people say, what's the difference between writing that, published now, and Witness to Hope in 1999? And I said, I got much more exercise when I was writing Witness to Hope, because the internet was just really getting started, and every time I wanted to look something up, I had to get up and walk to my library or go find a book or something. Whereas every time I wanted something in 2008, I just hit the computer and, there it is. There is no question that there is, and my friend, the previously referenced pediatrician, will tell you this, that social media is in the main a real curse for young people below a certain age. And that these mental health issues, this self-harming phenomenon, et cetera, are, in her view, largely a product of that environment. I think we do. There's a lot of very good stuff that I'm aware of, in America at least, I'm sure it's available elsewhere, that takes advantage of this technological change to be real instruments of new evangelization. I mean, the Augustine Institute in Denver creates a fantastic array of catechetical materials for all ages that are instantly available and that parish can subscribe to and enhance its catechetical life that way. But when I was in a Roman restaurant last spring with a friend who's lived here for many years, we were there a bit earlier than the usual dining hour, and we're waiting for a third person to join us, and so we're having a conversation. And then right over there is a family, a young family, parents maybe in their mid to late 30s, with a 10-year-old kid, and they're all looking at phones. I mean, there is a corrosive aspect to this addiction to technology. So the church is certainly going to have to continue to learn how to use it, but also to help people learn how to moderate their use of it. I mean, the cardinal virtue of temperance applies not just to the fruit of the vine and work of human hands. It applies to social media as well. Evelyn Blacklock, I think, wanted to have something, yeah.
This is working. Oh, here we go. You spoke a bit about some external obstacles to the churches being the kind of culture reforming counterculture that you envision, such as the existence of civil laws that make it difficult. But I wonder what you think are the biggest internal obstacles, whether that's mindset or something else.
The biggest internal obstacles to affecting the new evangelization, which is really what we're talking about here, in its public aspects, are the same as they have been since the Lord asked, when the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on earth? Because I think at the bottom of the program of those in the church who essentially want to surrender at least a fair amount of territory to the zeitgeist in the notion that that will get us a hearing, fundamentally involves a deficiency of faith, a lack of confidence in the power of the gospel. That's a hard thing to say. I don't enjoy saying it. Some of the people who manifest that lead, in many respects, admirable lives. But if you're making, in our American context, if you're making excuses for Catholic politicians who are facilitating the culture of death, the fundamental reason you're doing that is a deficiency of faith. Now, there's a deficiency of courage, there's a deficiency of prudence, and a few other things, but it's fundamentally a deficiency of faith. There is no question that for all that it has been weaponized by progressive Catholic forces to advance their agenda, and weaponized in I think, a very, very dishonest way. The crisis of clerical sexual abuse has been a huge problem, or the revelations of the crisis of Catholic. Now, to weaponize that in order to dismantle the law of celibacy or the nature of marriage, this is all completely foolish. 2 nights before Pope Francis was elected, I was doing Chris Matthews' program on MSNBC from atop the Augustinianum. It was late at night. I was not in a good mood. And he is ranting on about how the next pope has to change the law of celibacy because that'll prevent all this sexual abuse. And I had it, and I said, Chris, marriage is not a crime prevention program. Once we were off the air, the producer came around and gave me this huge hug and said, I've been waiting for somebody to do that to him for years. But there's no question that the failure to live the truths, and this is across the board, it's not just the abuse crisis, the failure to live the truths we know to be true and we ought to be proclaiming is a huge obstacle. And of course, that has also been weaponized by media and others against us, but we have to own that problem and solve it. And I think in many instances, certainly in the US, we have made enormous progress on that. But you can't take that out of the picture. Exhaustion is a factor in all of this. Again, I can only use American examples, but some of the best bishops in the United States are now necessarily spending an inordinate amount of time trying to save inner city Catholic schools, trying to save seminaries because of the financial pressures that have come about as a combination of abuse settlements and the plague dropping contributions. And people get exhausted. There's just not enough time for everything. So it's going to be much more up to lay faithful to be agents of the new evangelization that John Paul II called them to be in Redemptoris Missio. Father Cesare is calling a halt here.
So there is the last chance for the last question.
Oh, he's not calling a halt, he's calling a penultimate halt.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the culture of John Paul II. Because I've listened to people talk about the parish life of Jerzy Popiovusko and their enthusiasm for the parish was incredible. That's where they encountered Catholic culture. Do we have something like that, or do we need something like that in America, Germany, other places? Because it seems to me that it's a bit lacking, but what do you think?
Well, in the case of Karol Wojtyła, it was both a parish and a university chaplaincy, where, I mean, this is the first pope in ever, perhaps ever, certainly in hundreds of years, whose formative experiences as a young priest was working with young adults in creating a second center of campus ministry in Stalinist Poland, which was no easy thing to do. So that was centered at the parish of St. Florian in Krakow. And I think that was a formative experience for him, for his thinking about pastoral ministry, and and many other things. Love and responsibility begins there. World Youth Day begins there. A whole lot of, begin there. What I think some of us have discovered is that forming integrated Catholic lives is a matter of four things. I've discovered this in the program I run in Krakow every summer and have done for 30 years. And it took a while to figure this out. But in order to have a truly effective educational program for young adults, let's say, you need four components. First and foremost, you need a sacramental component, and particularly a Eucharistic component. You need an intellectual component. People want to know what the truth is. You need a cultural component. People have to be exposed to the riches of Catholic culture. Not hard to do in Krakow. But that's one of the reasons why, to go back to Wojtyła in 1948, he's teaching young people in this frozen choir loft at the parish of St. Florian the Missa de Angelis, so that they can sing Gregorian chant and imbibe Catholic culture that way. And the fourth thing you need is a true experience of Christian community. So, sacramental. By Christian community, I mean a free space where people can talk about what's on their minds, absent the pressures of the culture war. So, sacramental, intellectual, cultural, communitarian. You need all four of those, it seems to me. And if you look at the successful campus ministry programs around the world, like those run by our Dominican friends in Poland or the ones I know in the US, all four pieces are there. You need all four. And there are an infinity of variations on how you would put that together, but you got to have all four to create that countercultural church that can then be culture reforming. So I hope that's helpful.
Professor Weigel, thank you once again for your presence with us. I'd like to thank you, all of you here in Angelicum, and all of you in front of your screens. We hope to meet soon at a future lecture. Thank you very much.